Good evening, comrades, and welcome to Why Marx. Last week, we talked about the importance of human nature as an argument which is frequently used against us in the argument in favor of socialism or communism. This week, we're looking at one of the most important pieces of evidence that we can draw upon to show that capitalism is not immutable. It came into being at a historically specific time under revolutionary circumstances, and the implication is very clear. That it can be transcended and will be overthrown, superseded indeed. And tonight we have Rob Gould, who will be talking about primitive communism from the Ethnographic Notebooks of Karl Marx, which were compiled from 1880 onwards. And these were ethnographic notebooks on the work of Lewis Morgan. And then we'll go into the work of Frederick Engels, and Tina Werkmann will introduce us to Frederick Engels and his writings on the origin of the family, private property and the state, and the later development of those ideas by Rosa Luxemburg. And then Rob will come back in to talk about the application for modern anthropology. So without further ado, comrades, Rob Gould.
Today's discussion is to focus on the notion of primitive communism in Marxist writings. It is tempted to view pre-industrial society as a chaotic hand-to-mouth existence, and there is some truth to this. Subjected much more to the wants and whims of nature, pre-civilization human beings clearly adapted in a way to alter nature to meet its needs. The Darwinian ideas about evolution were contemporary to Marx and Lewis H. Morgan, an American ethnologist and anthropologist writing primarily about the societal structures of the Iroquois and other groups in the 1840s. We can really see the examination of early human society beginning in earnest with the logical progression of human beings from nature. Whether this is through the development of the hand and cranial capacities proposed by Vygotsky, or due to the amphibious ape theorem posited by Hardy and Elaine Morgan, it is not the discussion focus of today. Of more interest is the ongoing discovery of prehistoric cultures and production. 100,000-year-old beads made for decoration with material sourced from further flung corners of the inhabited world indicate that the societies of the past were capable of far more than they are normally accredited. With this in mind, we are forced to imagine societies in a far distant past with formulations unknown, and it is in this void that the concept of primitive communism becomes manifest. So in the first part of the presentation, I'm going to talk about the definition of primitive communism, and I'm going to talk about the definition of primitive accumulation. The sources I used for this section were primarily the Ethnographic Notebook. Karl Marx compiled it in 1880 and 1881. It was only published in 1972 with a foreword from L. Crader. I'm also going to refer to Capital, specifically chapter 32 on primitive accumulation. Also going to reference The Origin of the Family, Private Property and the State by Frederick Engels in 1884. And David Harvey's analysis of primitive accumulation kind of comes into my understanding of it. So, what is primitive communism? It is to Engels that we can really turn for a convenient definition. It is a society structured around the production of goods to need in a state of nature. That is to say, large family groups with the division of necessary labour being split within it. Beyond this, it can be said that the difference of these varied groups of non-industrial societies is a difference from that of a capitalistic society, and it runs deeper than the division of labour and can be seen in the ideas of property, exchange, and the relationship with nature. The work behind this theory was an almost global examination of societies afflicted by colonialism. That's really what Morgan is looking at. Looking at the structure of those societies and making comparisons to argue that there is a staged progression to the development of civilization, which is really equivalent to the preconditions of social development, which I think Tina is going to talk more about later. The study ranges from property relations within the Iroquois to constructions of familial relations in Hawaii. Lewis Morgan puts it to us that these societies have a fundamental difference in outlook in regard to the relation of the person to society. That unlike industrial relations, that person is not in opposition to the societal structure. To Morgan, Marx, and Engels, this represented an alternative to capitalist consciousness that could clearly bolster the argument that accumulation is not human nature, and that other societies have existed and can exist where the social relation to structure is not one of oppression. There are notable breaks in the thinking between Marx and Morgan, namely in the focus and orientation of the research carried out by Morgan. Marx criticizes the way in which Morgan holds the Iroquois model in too high a regard, pointing to problems with the election of its leaders and chiefs, which speaks to Marx's position against authority structures. He also blurs the lines about historical development and critiques a fixed approach to the analysis of such cultures as following an overriding pattern of societal development. In the Ethnographic Notebook, he reorders Morgan's thesis, placing property relations before government, which speaks again to Marx's underlying analysis that property relations become the basis for exploitation, which expands frequently and in more depth within the concept of primitive accumulation. It's safe to assume that Morgan, Marx, and Engels agreed that this is not a societal structure to emulate. To quote Engels on this, man's attitude to nature was therefore one of almost complete subjection to a strange, incomprehensible power. Primitive communism is subjected to nature. And that's from the Origins of Family, chapter 3. Origins of the Family, chapter 3. This means that the society was too temperamental and dependent on the unpredictable patterns of nature, and that within these societies there was still a tendency to see other groups as enemies and wage regional war. It required a very sparse population over a vast geographical area to be viable and not doomed to failure, which would not fit the conditions of industrial Europe with its vast population density. The work on this is incredibly detailed and for its time was complementary of societies that had previously been dismissed as backwards and godless. But there is much wrong with the framework that they used to approach the issue. I would agree with the hinting of Marx within the Ethnographic Notebook that it is too fixed on the ideas of concrete historical development, and too often uses references from great ancient civilizations of Rome and the Hellenes to identify societal trends in the studied groups. Looking in vain for a law of development, a process which in itself kind of strips the indigenous groups of their individual character and rejects that they have any unique conceptions and altogether alien societal structures. The language has been challenged in the 20th century as well. Primitive in itself connotes a backwardsness and underplays the thousands of years of social development that happened in these societies. Just because they have different relations to industrial society does not necessarily mean that they are underdeveloped. Similarly, we see savagery used frequently. I shout back to kind of Rousseau's concept of the noble savage, which implies a proximity to animalistic order. That is to deny the full humanity of these groups. Modern literature would prefer the term pre-Marxist communism to describe these groups, and I would argue that this fits better now we have a more nuanced view of the developments within these societies. Above all, what we can take from this theory into modern discourse is a relative outlook on societal structures, that there are alternatives to the social relations of capital, and that these structures can endure for an indefinite amount of time. So, now we go on to primitive accumulation. In chapter 32 of Capital, Marx outlines the theory of primitive accumulation. And while there is probably enough within this chapter for a standalone session, the essentials of the theory are this: that the foundation of all accumulation is the separation of the bulk of society from the common ownership of land, and the reduction of those separated to that of wage labourers, while the new emergent class of landowners exploit them for surplus value extraction by the production of commodities. The primary example of this is the progression of feudal England into industrial society, beginning with the abolition of the common land via bloody legislation and the mass movements of peasant agrarians to the town to become industrial workers. There is room here to discuss how this impacts on the conception of stage theory, but again, we'll have to attend to this matter in another session, or perhaps expand it in the discussion later. So, how does this relate to primitive communism? Marx in Capital cites examples from many pre-Marxist communist societies about the individual circumstances of this expropriation, including the transatlantic slave trade and the treatment of colonies by European imperialists. It's important to note that this is, primitive accumulation is an inbuilt mechanism of capital accumulation that seeks to bring all peoples and all lands into the production of saleable commodity. And that in this process, it destroys the previous societal systems through legislation, violence, and barter. That is to say, it seeks to assimilate and remove all contradictory structures and victimizes those who lived in pre-Marxist communist societies. Over to you, Tina.
Thank you very much, Rob. Yes, very interesting. The thoughts of Engels and Marx on anthropology and on primitive communism, so to speak, or Urkommunismus, as they actually wrote it, which is slightly better. Original communism. It's a real definition, much better. They're really interesting timeline almost of the development of anthropology. And becomes really clear when you look at the Communist Manifesto written in 1848, where they wrote, first sentence, really important: the history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles. That's what they believed, that there were always class struggles. That's how history developed, one class against another, fueling developments, etc. And 40 years later, things had changed so much and developed so much further that Engels had to write in a foreword. Actually, that's not true. That is written history, i.e. since we've started writing our books, written by the victors of history. That's the reflection of the class struggle. But long before written history was an entirely different manner of living together. And Engels, after Marx died in 1883, he went through his papers and he found his notes on a book called Ancient Society, a book written by the progressive US scholar Lewis Henry Morgan that Rob had referred to, written in 1877, which deals with a lot of things that Rob described, the description of how through vast majority of history, people seem to have lived differently. So Engels went on, he thought he was, fulfilling Marx's will. He went through the notes that Marx compiled and started writing his own book, making use of other studies and other scholars that have had turned up in that time, and started the whole aspect of anthropology to write the origin of the family, private property, and the state, and did his own research as well, etc. Now, this was really a groundbreaking book in that it put Morgan's discoveries in a political context and sort of sorted Morgan a little bit. Morgan was not a socialist of any kind, so Engels tried to, make it applicable to socialists and take it over and put it in political context. That made it quite groundbreaking, as I said, but it's very much a book of its time. Not a great read, actually, I think, for a number of levels. He's not as good a writer as Marx, for a start. Also, he does what a lot of socialists did at the time, i.e. critiquing others at length, so that you have a lot of, he's taking apart Haxhausen and others, people, scientists of the time. They were important, but they've gone long out of fashion. So it's a long pages after pages after pages, taking theories apart that we don't even know about anymore. That can be a bit grinding. Also, the terms, he takes over Morgan's terms of savagery, etc., almost without qualification. And I think the biggest problem with the book, it is very descriptive rather than analytical. So Engels doesn't go into the why have societies changed. He just describes it. Nevertheless, the description of these societies is huge. It's huge importance and huge implications. And especially Engels was very interested in, and it was used like that ever since, the role of the woman. That in capitalism, women have such a low position and so exploited. And his book really went a great way, at great length, to say, in the past, women held the central position in society. They were the most important, and look what capitalism has done to women. So it's very much written from that perspective, which is, as a woman, and a socialist, that was hugely important at the time, that he looked at it from a female perspective, not from a female, but you know what I mean. He put the woman into the foreground. So he he used, as I say, Morgan's description of the various periods. And in German, it's actually savagery is Wildheit. Again, not quite as bad as savagery. So Wildheit is wildness, you know. So he describes that hunters and gatherers lived in communistic, egalitarian, and most important, matrilineal households. Women hold a special position, which is based around collective childcare. Land and basic means of production are held in common by the Gents. These are large, Gent is a large family based around the woman. So, you know, there's group marriage, he describes. So group marriage, so it's all based around the woman's household. The sisters, her mother, her brother, her dad, you know, they all live together, the kids, of course. Men come and go, you know, and that is a very interesting description. If the man behaves, he might stay around a little while longer, but usually, you know, he does the deed, he brings the meat, he gets a shag occasionally, but if he doesn't behave, out he goes. And, you know, it's the woman deciding, sometimes her mother, sometimes the sisters, etc. But it's very much based on the woman's household. If there's anything to pass on, bow and arrow, those kind of things, you know, there's no private property. It goes to the Gent after the death of a person. A number of Gents make up a tribe, and the decisions are made by elected heads of the Gents. That varies slightly in different tribes, of course, but these are the general rules. So there's no nuclear family. There's nothing like mom, dad, and child living together happily in a hut or something. Nothing like that. These are huge Gents working and living together. No private property to speak of. No slavery, which is very interesting. These people had no use for slaves. There were, of course, contradictions. There were confrontations with other tribes occasionally, very occasionally, because they actually lived quite far apart from each other. When there was a confrontation or a war of sorts, most often they got killed, the other side, you know, or they got adopted in the family, which seems to be more often the case, actually. So rather than killing them, they adopted the losers into the Gents, and that seemed to work quite well. It brings new genes into the gene pool, etc. So that was actually quite welcome. And this, I mean, one degree or another, we know our Homo sapiens emerged around 200,000 years ago, but before that, our ancestors, they also lived as hunter-gatherers to one degree or another for up to 2 million years, really. But 10,000 years ago, something happened, and we know now what happened. Engels didn't really at the time, so he just describes it, he doesn't analyze it. It seems that, you know, our way of living, or the communistic way of living like this, was so successful that more and more humans were born, which led to scarcity. Big game was much reduced, you know, the meat-based diet, etc. It became a problem. People were actually starting to hunger. When beforehand, you know, you throw a spear and you hit a mammoth or something like that. There was so many big games there. It was no problem at all. So they lived in abundance up to about 10,000 years ago when scarcity first happened. This then led to the area of barbarism, or the Neolithic, as it's called. Today, that's seen as you know, that's when civilization really started, farming, etc. When in fact, it actually seems that was the counter-revolution. That was the beginning of the end for the women, at least, and with it, the beginning of slavery, the beginning of patriarchy, private property, class society, racism, etc., etc. So what happened? Hunting continued to a degree, but farming had to be developed out of necessity because there was scarcity with big game, etc. So farming developed, breeding and domestication of animals, land ownership started to develop. And what developed with that? Inheritable wealth. You know, if you own a piece of land, or you work this piece of land and you really put your hard work into it, you know, you want the need develops to pass it on to your children, which then, you know, in a group marriage, that becomes quite problematic. The woman has her children. The woman knows these are my children, but she doesn't just stick with one man in primitive communism. The group marriage, you know, she has sex with all sorts of men as she pleases. So the woman knows who her children is, the man doesn't. And this becomes a problem in this period, the Neolithic. The man, the stronger, wants to inherit, wants to make sure his wealth goes to his children, and that needs a more control over the woman. This becomes a pairing marriage, now starts about 6000 BC, where, it's still relatively easy to dissolve a marriage or a pairing, but, the children still stay with the woman, but the man now, they insist that they know who their children are. Marx and Engels called this the overthrow of mother right, which was the world historic defeat of the female sex. And Engels makes a really, important political point that this then led to the rise of all the other crap. It's not money that's the problem. It's this period where the men take the power from the woman and make her a property, as with all the other things that he owns becomes a property. Lionel Sims of the Radical Anthropology group calls this an incremental, slow counter-revolution. So it was not like the men get together and club the women over the head and have a revolution of any kind. So it's a slow thing, couple of thousands of years, really, when this happens. Not a revolution as we talk about today, but a hugely important period where everything's changed. Everything that's gone before for perhaps 100,000 years, 200,000 years is overthrown in a couple of thousand years. This then leads, of course, to the third stage of human development, which is the civilization, as Morgan calls it. Happily, that's where we live in. On a marriage level, that's reflected in monogamy, supplemented by very widespread adultery and prostitution, because human beings are not really made for monogamy. There's a really good quote by Engels, which I reach out now. It was not in any way the fruit of individual sex love, this monogamy, with which it had nothing whatever to do. Marriages remained as before, marriages on convenience. It was the first form of the family to be based not on natural, but on economic conditions, on the victory of private property over primitive, natural, communal property. The Greeks themselves put the matter quite frankly. The sole exclusive aim of monogamous marriage were to make the man supreme in the family and to propagate as the future heirs to his wealth, children indisputably his own. So the marriage is there to make wealth inheritable, really, to make sure that you can pass on wealth. It becomes bigger, well, otherwise, you don't work quite as hard if you can't pass it on to your children. Again, Engels puts a lot of effort and emphasis on the role of women, and has lots of quotes on, in civilization, look how pretty these women look there, with their little waist, and the rich women up there, they don't have to work. All they do is hang around and get really, really bored. He describes how they have a really alienated life, rich women. Poor women, of course, poor women of the working class, as this picture shows, they not only have to look after the children, they have to look after the household, and they often have to go to work as well. They're now dragged into the working class, the industrialized proletariat. So for women, capitalism is the worst possible society. They get punished 3 times over, or they're bored, to tears when they're the rich lady. So the lady of civilization has an infinitely lower social position than the hardworking woman of barbarism. On the other hand, of course, this civilization, and he describes it as well, has within it the seeds of socialism, abundance. Now, because of the revolutionized means of production, abundance is possible, which allows for the development of socialism. I'm going to quickly touch on Rosa Luxemburg, who wrote on a similar subject in 1910, called The Introduction to Political Economy, Einführung in die Nationalökonomie. It was only published in 1924, 5 years after she'd been murdered. But it is an absolutely stunning work. I really encourage comrades to read it. She's writes in a really engaging way for a start. She's a superb writer. She really is much better than Engels. Funny, witty, clever, really good turn of phrase, etc. It's an absolute joy to read her stuff. Also, she had the advantage of having another 25 years where developments were happening. Colonialism was really expanding, and with it, reports about all these strange societies. So it started, and she describes it beautifully. It started where, colonialism in Africa. Oh, we found this village where the people don't know what property is. Everything is held in common. Oh, we found something in Russia that's quite similar. Oh, in Germany, then Germany, now Germany, there's something very similar as well. And in America, South America, Africa, everywhere the colonialists went, they found the same things. Clan units where there was no rich and poor, no idlers and no workers, no masters and slaves, where all public affairs were dealt with by the free vote and decision of all. And she describes this here, this village communism was not at all a peculiarity of a particular race or people or part of the world, but rather the general and typical form of human society at a certain level of cultural development. And she makes the really important point when Engels and Morgan, they were talking about the past. She's saying they still exist. They're still around. 18th century, you have primitive communists, Urkommunist, village communism, as she calls it, or agrarian communism, still going on everywhere. And they were fighting back against the colonialists. They were, getting together and defeating them often in very many areas. And she describes it very beautifully. If you want to read it, it's part of Peter Hoodis's translation, or he's edited actually the economic writings of Rosa Luxemburg. And she makes the really important point. This is a tiny blip. Capitalism, private property, all of this is a tiny blip in the huge development of humanity, which has been, until very, very recently, 100 years, 200 years ago in some areas where this was still ongoing. And she describes that, she says quite rightly, Morgan's ancient society formed, as it were, a subsequent introduction to the Communist Manifesto of Marx and Engels. You have to read them together to understand socialism is possible, because that's how it used to be. This used to be the rule. It's capitalism, which is the strange one, which is which is a strange way of living, totally alienated and not in control of our means of production and of each other and the way we live. So she made that really good point, and it's as I say, it's a joy to read. There have been developments, of course, since Engels and Luxemburg, as you'd expect. It's been over 100 years. And this is something I can only touch on because of time reasons, but I would urge comrades to check out the work of the radical anthropology group. And they basically looked at, how did it get to that first stage of savagery, though? How did it come? You had communities organized around the woman and not the strong. Men are stronger, aren't they? They got more muscles, etc. Why wouldn't, how did it come that everything was organized around the woman's household? And they believe, and they think there's evidence of this, that collective child collective child rearing wasn't always so. It used to be more like chimpanzees do it, so it was the woman had to do it all. Each woman, her own children. And that is hugely, as we know, anybody who has a child knows how much work it takes to raise a child, one woman, if it's one woman doing it. It's clearly something that should be collectivized, the point that Engels makes in his book very, very much. And the comrades from the radical anthropology group say that there must have happened something, and there's another piece of evidence, which is the brain size around 200,000 years ago really massively expanded. Again, not overnight, obviously over a number of thousands of years, but humans, early, our ancestors, their brain used to be 300 grams. And today's Homo sapiens is 1.3 kilograms. So it's massively, the size of the people didn't change much, but the brain massively expanded, which led to culture, the beads that have been found, etc., language, etc. So you need a brain mass to do that. But in order for the brain to grow, is evidence that a collectivization of childcare had to happen, because just women doing it themselves, it's just too expansive for a woman to do. And there is evidence that this happened. And clearly, the fact that we can see there were not matrilineal clans supports this point. So they believe there was a kind of human revolution led by women who bounded together against the stronger man and said, you know, sex strike theory, etc. Again, I can't go into this, but there was a revolution led by females that led to that first stage. There was a stage before, which was probably savage, actually. And this, what's called now savagery, was more like women-led early communist society. So I do urge comrades to check that out. The Radical Anthropology group, hugely interesting. They have regular meetings and they've done an awful lot of work on that. Future society, we've touched on that in recently. What does this, you know, what can this tell us about a future society, and should we go back? You know, should communists argue to rip apart capitalism, you know, destroy factories, etc., and live again on the land, with the land, move from place to place and hunt and gather? And I don't think, as Rob said, I don't think Marx and Engels said that was a good idea, and Morgan didn't either. And there's a nice quote of Morgan, not a socialist, but Marx and Engels do quote him, and they say, you know, he says the future society, it will be a revival in a higher form of the liberty, equality, and fraternity of the ancient gentes, the matrilineal clans. So that it's going forward, not back. It's not about population control, which the Greens in a number of countries still demand. You know, we have to stop breeding so much. Humans are the problem. We can't have that many humans on the planet. And, you know, if we lived in tribes again, that would be true, but that is not the answer for sure, you know, ripping up the means of production, but using them for what we need, what the planet needs, and obviously producing in a much healthier and ecological way, which can be done. So this is the point I believe that we need to learn, looking at the past to see we used to live as communists. We were communists and throughout the vast majority of our lifetime, and taking that forward, taking over the means of production, changing everything, changing how we produce to once again live collectively, you know, have collective child rearing for a start, and much, much more. Liberate women and liberate all of society with it. Thanks.
Okay. So I'm going to come back in now, and I'm going to examine a few groups and talk a bit more about primitive communism in the 21st century, or I prefer the terms, you know, how do you say it? Urkommunism? Is that how you'd say? I think that seems to be a better term. A small comment on Tina's presentation. I think you're a bit harsh on the Neolithic peoples world over. I think certainly there was a beginning of patriarchy, but then there's also a number of Neolithic societies that seem to have female deities at the kind of center of their cultures. Notably the Temple people on Malta and the Minoans in the Aegean, in which women seem to have a different social status, but we can't, you know, obviously there's no written history that survives of these people, so it's hard to kind of say what those structures would have looked like. Anyway, I'll begin the sharing of my slides here, and I'll get my talk up. Okay, so in the 21st century, there are remnants of pre-Marxist communist groups scattered around the world. This part of the presentation is going to examine some of these groups out with a definitive framework and from a position of relative observation of traditions and practices, particularly focusing around property and labor relations. There are numerous examples of societies that we could focus on. In the preparation for this, I looked at the Maori, I looked at the Aboriginals in Australia, I looked at various groups around the world, and I've decided to only focus on two because of kind of time constraints. We're going to look at two living examples today that have had different conventions of property and assess their conditions today. Now, what's interesting about these societies as well is it kind of presents a different view to Tina's, in that these societies are patriarchal. Okay, so these are societies that have had a long history of patriarchy, and this is not to say disagree with the radical anthropologists' radical anthropology group's overall thesis, but it just so happens that the ones that I looked at today for today were patriarchal. Anyway, right. So we start off with the Nuchaluth people of the indigenous inhabitants of what is now the Pacific Northwest in Canada. This society was built on a water-based lifestyle with the common collection of the bounties of the sea for the distribution amongst the people of differing tribal groups up and down the coastlines. So there's a number of familial tribal groups that lived up and down the Pacific Northwest in Canada, and they share common cultures and common language. There is a history of conflict within these groups, but as Tina kind of rightly pointed out, the nature of the conflict is a little different. It's not as all-consuming. It was, you know, a smaller affair. It was a less the overall human cost was much lessened in these conflicts. There is a social hierarchy that's being built around chieftain class and a commoner class, which, you know, Morgan refers to. The commoner class, while autonomous, still has to request permissions to fish or forage in tribal territories from the regional chiefs. However, this relationship is two-sided in that it is also the responsibility of the chief to redistribute wealth fairly or risk a drop in status. The greatness of a chief is not measured in his personal wealth, but in the ability of that chief to provide for the members of the nation. So this represents a fundamental difference in the relationship of labour and society, that members in essence labour for a common good. And this difference in the relationship to labour can most clearly be seen in whaling practices, which is what the image here is from. Again, while it's, you know, in the modern world, it's widely considered unethical to hunt whales, I don't think it's fair to judge a society by kind of Western conceptions of animal rights. It's a whole different relationship with nature that we're looking at here. A much more sustainable practice of whaling, while still cruel to the animal, has an important societal function, and, you know, that's for individuals to kind of weigh up themselves. Whaling in this society was seen as a sacred and dangerous task, and to take part in the hunt was a great honour and a rite of passage for kind of male members of the group. It's important to note that it is the chief who must take the most dangerous role in the hunt as lead harpoonist, and that his divine ability to subdue a whale was further proof of his right to rule, that the god, you know, the nature gods favoured him as the person who could bring down the whale. And this again has a different, you know, this shows us a different societal structure to the conception of labour and leadership in capitalist societies. It speaks to a social relation that is different than capital relations, and that the ruler has a duty to their people, and this duty includes their personal risk and personal labour, and is not simply based on the exploitation of others. The complexities of this social structure is still being studied today, although it is becoming increasingly difficult to find Nuchaluth peoples who stick to their indigenous social structures. In relation to land, the Nuchaluth people have a spiritual connection to the native cedar trees that populate the Pacific Northwest. They have trees that are marked out as culturally significant because of their historic use for harvesting bark. The cedar can live to be over 1,000 years old, and these trees can be seen to provide the Nuchaluth with a continuity rarely found in indigenous groups. In addition to this, the cedar wood tree was an incredibly important resource of the historic and modern Nuchaluth. Not only are they ceremoniously cut and harvested, they provide the wood for totem poles, canoes, and housing that were the foundations of the culture. The trees were harvested sustainably. Bark was cut from the living tree and allowed to heal, providing a continual supply of building materials extracted sustainably from nature. This shows how the Nuchaluth concepts of land and ownership are distinct from that of industrial relations. There is a respect for nature and a moderated consumption of wood because of the importance of their continuation. The fact that these areas still remain so heavily forested, despite an indefinite number of generations living there, speaks to the sustainability that defies the exploitative relationship of capital and land. Today, the Nutchannuth people are embroiled in a legal dispute with the Canadian government about the ownership of a patch of such woodland on Nootka Island. In recent years, the prevalence of cooperation of the tribal councils with logging companies, such as Western Forest Products Incorporated, is leading to the destruction of these woodlands. To add to this, to ensure the survival of their people's culture, they've had to dispose of traditional values, turn to economic development, to fight such legal cases and to pay historical debts imposed upon them. And thus, the population is alienated from common ownership and forced to wage labor as loggers, fishermen, and tourist crafters, selling the once ceremonially significant totem pole to visitors of the Pacific Northwest. They are to publish their monetary earnings and pay a proper tax to the state. This is a clear and apparent example of ongoing primitive accumulation. Although the fundamental changes happened in colonial times, there is still a large degree of expropriation happening within these communities. So the next group I'm going to examine are the Maasai people. The Maasai people are an African ethnic group in modern-day Kenya and Tanzania. There are over there's close to 2 million Maasai peoples in this region, and their territory has been limited to savanna national parks. The Maasai traditionally have no fixed property at all. They are dependent on the continual harvest of cattle herds, and they labor in the protection from predators and the guidance of their animals to pastures new. Different members of the family provide different roles, with the male role being to escort and maintain the cattle, and the female role to build and sustain the whole home and the family, which again is in the kind of creche format that Tina alluded to earlier. The females would are collectively responsible for the maintenance of the accommodation, and the rearing of children, of course, an important note. So all resources to build these structures would have been traditionally foraged from the savannah by the women, which shows you the kind of skill and the status that they have in that society. But again, there are some practices and traditions that we may kind of frown upon within this group. Notably, the practice of female genital mutilation, hunting of lions. But again, it's, these are complex societal structures. They are ancient societal structures, and we have to kind of question our own conceptions on the validity of these. The Maasai also have no kind of money form. They've got no money form at all. Until the turn of the 20th century, they based their wealth on the heads of cattle under the command of an individual. This is again distinct from the property and exchange relation under capital. For one, cattle can self-reproduce without human exploitation. If you have a breeding pair of cattle, your wealth becomes, suddenly, infinite. And if you can kind of continually expand that, it becomes greater and greater. Therein, with careful management, any Maasai could grow their herd over generations. There is still a patriarchal hierarchy with spiritual leaders representing different regions. The spiritual leaders themselves have no political influence, but help resource management and shape the religious beliefs of these people. So today, the Maasai are under threat from multiple angles. The conservation land allotted to them is being encroached upon by hunting and poaching companies as the commodification of African wildlife expands. There is a notable connection between the United Arab Emirates and the poaching, the hunting grounds that are being acquired from the Maasai National Park. The United Arab Emirates actually owns the company that's buying up huge amounts of Maasai land. So that's an interesting connection. Social pressures and the decreasing quality of grazing land has forced many Maasai to adopt fixed agriculture, growing maize crops for the production of cereals. The government since the mid-20th century has been attempting to help the economical development of the Maasai people by encouraging group ranching, which then commodifies the cattle of the Maasai for the sale into the wider market. Originally in the 20th century, this was done to avoid creating a big landless workforce, a huge social problem that you're going to have to deal with. But over time, we are witnessing these group ranches being broken down as individual ranches are being set up in Maasai territory. So yeah, increasingly the Maasai are abandoning their traditional way of life and migrating to towns. As recently as 2009, Maasai people have been evicted from their traditional land to make way for corporate ranches and governmental economic developments. So to conclude, while the mainstream media may draw attention to these groups now and then to show their plight and suffering at the hands of big corporations, there is little done to examine the root of destruction of these communities and the lessons that we as a society could take from them. Even the work of modern anthropology is focused on easing the tensions between indigenous groups and capitalistic relationships to land. The focus of being on the economic development of these groups, which is, to be blunt, the OECD's code for what can they produce and what can they sell. How can we maximize the profitability of these indigenous groups is the question that anthropologists kind of ask in a hedged way. Perhaps through tourist package experience or outright packaged experiences or outright repossession. In every case I've studied for preparation for this paper, you can see the greasy smear of capital corroding these independent cultures. It seems inevitable that the pre-Marxist communistic societies are doomed to fall prey to the reproduction of capital. So I've ended with a few avenues for potential discussion. I'm sure members will come up with their own, but I thought we could maybe discuss what the concept of primitive communism means for the left today. How can we use this in our theoretical development? Do we agree with the concept of stage theory, that human society reaches a certain point of development and then by necessity evolves into a different kind of form of social relation? And to what extent should we involve ourselves with the struggles of pre-Marxist communist societies today? And that's my talk. Thank you.
Excellent, Rob. Thank you very much. And thank you very much, Tina. Two excellent presentations. And I think there's quite a lot of food for thought there. So the usual caveat, there are no stupid questions. Please feel free to put your hand up if you want to ask anything. I will naturally abuse the chair's privilege of asking a couple of questions of my own. But first of all, Nick, over to you.
Okay, well, thank you, Comrade Chair, and thank you to Rob and Tina for really interesting and enjoyable introductions. One of the most important things that I think we can learn from this discussion has already been emphasized, but I think it's worth restating, and that is, for the vast majority of human existence, whether as Homo sapiens for 200 to 300,000 years, or as other forms of humans for more than 1 million years, the existence of human society and of Homo sapiens has been in societies that are egalitarian and where personal liberty is first and foremost. And I think that's really important, because what it says, as Tina emphasized, is that for the overwhelming majority, it's like having a day and it's all but for the last half hour of the day, human society has been equal and free. And for those 300,000 years of Homo sapiens, anthropologists now, not just radical anthropologists, but most anthropologists agree that society was organized in what's called hunter-gatherer societies. Also the term immediate return subsistence. And I have to say, when I was a lot younger, I used to think that in these societies, it was very hard, it was very difficult. People had to eke out an existence, they would go without food and so on. And of course, all of that's completely wrong, because these societies lived from nature. They picked the berries, they picked the fruits, they picked the nuts, they lived off them, they hunted together as bands. And one of the important things that I think we can glean or come out of a discussion like this is that it's conditions that determine consciousness, it determines culture, it determines the way that human society organizes. And in the hunter-gatherer societies, when they could simply reach out to nature and take what they needed, they had time to have leisure, they had time to enjoy, they had time to laugh. And it was actually a very relatively easy life. And even the fossil remains that have been analyzed show that the diet was very good. In fact, the diet, when we move to farming, they can actually show from the analysis of the bones that when human society moved to farming, the diet became even worse. It would be, well, deteriorated significantly, because instead of having all the richness of the fruit, the fiber, the meat from the animals and so on, they spent all day pulping maize or corn or whatever and living off bread, and didn't have the same diet. But in those societies, you think about it, things had to be done collectively. If you wanted to organize the way you lived, you shared out responsibilities. If you wanted to go on a hunting trip, you did that collectively. One person can't bring back a great big animal that you've killed. It's a collective exercise. And in these societies, it wasn't just that there was an absence of hierarchy. It wasn't just that there was equality between people. There was an equality of the sexes. And again, that's something that disappeared over time. So we've got 300,000 years plus before Homo sapiens, where our existence has been built or lived in this commonality. I don't know whether you can call it common ownership, but people inhabited the earth, and they looked at the earth, they treated the earth with respect, and they moved on. They moved where the next hunt would be. They moved on where the next fruit and so on would be, and they lived in harmony with nature. And then about 12,000 years ago, for all sorts of different reasons, including climate change and so on, you had already had the beginning, and this is where I've got some differences with Rob, actually. About 30 to 40,000 years, I'm not an expert, by the way, but this is so, people come back and shoot me down, please. But as I've read, about 30 to 40,000 years ago, you had the development alongside the hunter-gatherer nomadic existence. You had more sedentary developments. And one of the locations for this that I've seen researched and written about was in Northwest America, so along the coast where salmon fishing and so on. And the argument that I've heard put forward is that with the development of sedentary farming and fishing, this is when you began to get the development of a hierarchy, that you began to get a surplus and the need to protect that surplus, and the development of the hierarchy. I think it's important that we understand this didn't happen overnight. It wasn't something that you could perceive even probably within your own lifetime, but over many, 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 many generations. But the development of a hierarchy that's able, as Rob pointed to, more in a more contemporary way, where a chief or a ruler is able to distribute rights or property, suggests that that's a development of a hierarchy in which the hierarchy can abuse and will abuse the position. They'll want to pass on the wealth. They'll want to protect it from others. They'll dish it out or dole it out to members of the same kinship line, the same lineage. They'll exclude others, and you'll get competition. And so you get the development of what's called patrilineal societies, where instead of the man going to live with the woman's family or band, the woman goes to live with the man's tribe, the woman is isolated, the woman is separated from her family, and over again, a period of time, the men in society gain the dominance over the women. And so you not only get the development of class society and the development of a hierarchy, you get the erosion of sexual equality and sexual liberty. But what it does show is that the attitudes are the product of the way that human society organized itself. So anthropologists have studied, as Robert has talked about, anthropologists have studied more contemporary societies that can continue to live in isolation almost, but with some aspects of these societies that must have existed 20 to 200,000 years ago. And what it shows is that they're not all completely egalitarian, but there are examples where they are egalitarian, and also there's sexual equality. And the anthropologists have written, for example, if somebody steps out of line, particularly if there's an alpha male, so to speak, who starts pushing themselves forward or abusing his size or his power or whatever, the women in the tribe will gather together and ridicule him until he learns his lesson, or even drive him out of the tribe. And that shows that actual culture, the way that people want to protect their equality and their liberty, is something that arises out of the organization of society. So I've spoken a lot for longer than I intended, but I want to leap right to the other end, because the argument might come back and does come back. Well, that's all very well in a simple society when you're living off berries and fruit, but it will never work in the modern world, in the contemporary world. I don't agree with that position at all. What it shows is that if you live in harmony with each other and harmony with nature, the way that you treat each other will change. And so we have to aim for a new form of society which is based on the collective common ownership, where everybody is treated equally because we are all equal in relation to the world and the resources in it.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Nick. Do you want to come back on any of that before we move on? I'm keen to get as many people in as I can, but at the same time, obviously there may be things you want to respond to quickly. Yep, Rob.
Yeah, I'd like to come back on that. I think, above all, I think it's important. I think it's harmful to think of these societies, because the Maasai and the Nutchaluf, they are not capitalist economies, right? That in their original conception they weren't capitalist. They might have been patriarchal, they weren't capitalist. And I think it's important to kind of think about these things in a kind of relative way, and that the formations of individual family groups and the power dynamics within individual family groups would have been incredibly varied and vastly, different according to your environmental conditions and according to the resources you had available to you. And I think I think it's dangerous to kind of try and typify these peoples as all sharing similar kind of traits, a similar kind of outlook on the world. I think that, each individual group developed almost in isolation, not entirely in isolation. There was obviously neighboring groups of people that would have influenced their thinking, but they did develop they've got their own cultural identity, and that cultural identity is unique to them, and to try and homogenize them and to say that there is a particular model of human familial relations that is practiced world over is no nonsense. And then Morgan himself points to this when he talks about the kind of the marital relationships of people in Hawaii. He says, oh yeah, so in Hawaii, when a man marries a woman, or a woman marries a man, they also marry the sister of the woman and the brother on the brothers. So if there's two brothers and two sisters, they marry each other. There's all these kind of strange conceptions of family structures that are individual and unique. And also it would be to kind of talk about the 30,000 years ago, that that we have this clear move into the sedentary kind of existence. This is true. There are examples of different sedentary societies that never progressed into capitalism or never progressed into a patriarchy. If we look at the kind of cradle of civilization, the kind of earliest human civilizations, we're looking at an area that was vastly deprived of natural resources, a very temperamental area in the Tigris Basin, prone to a mass amount of drought and then flooding. So the societies there grouped together in order to survive, and you know, I've come to understand that as the kind of foundation of the superstructure. You know, the first cities as such, where there was an exploitative relation and an over-reliance on agrarian relationships. Everything else Nick said, I agree with. I think that there's a truth in the fact that people were healthier in the hunter-gatherer society. The strength of people's bones, the dental records speak to an entirely kind of different a different relationship with health than that of the civilized farming communities, where you see typically a lot of broken bones, arced back spinal columns from ploughing the fields, from hard manual labor, and you see, you know, this kind of degradation of people's health. Shorter life expectancies certainly, but in agrarian societies, those life expectancies were shorter than they were in hunter-gatherer societies. Evidence, you know, we're looking at the archaeological evidence from human skeletons there. So that would be what I would say. Thanks.
Tina.
Yeah, that was an interesting contribution, Nick, and I think you put your finger on it, and I didn't really say that, is the surplus question. Of course, with farming, with, you know, rearing of animals, for the first time, you don't live from hand to mouth anymore. You don't, you know, the hunter-gatherers, there was abundance of meat, of animals running around, berries, everything. You didn't have to plan. You just lived and, you know, worked very little and partied a lot and had a lot of time for play and living. And with the scarcity, then came the need to produce differently. With that came the surplus, indeed. So you produce more than you need. And then you think about, what am I doing with this? You know, exchange it with somebody else who can do something else with it. So division of labor becomes more widespread, etc., etc. Inheritable wealth develops. The man needs to know that, or the owner, you know, of the means of production of the farm, etc., wants to know that his children get it. So you need to control the woman to make sure she only has your children and not somebody else's children. But with that, of course, with that surplus then develops the idea of abundance, i.e. that we're now in a position, although vast majority of people are starving in today's society or don't know how to pay their bills, etc., we are in a society where we could produce easily everybody's food needs, you know, all over the world, twice over, 3 times over. Do you remember the butter mountains that get thrown into the sea because it's not worth giving it to people? You know, it's not, you can't sell it, so we destroy it. And it's not just butter, it's with everything. So, you know, we could produce things for all the population and more, and could easily feed billions of people around the planet, but, you know, in a much better way if the majority control the means of production. That's the key, isn't it? So abundance now allows to, as Morgan said, to, you know, learn from the past, but not to repeat it and go back to hunter-gatherer, but on a higher level. So we collectivize, etc. We take them over and we work 10 hours a week, if that. You know, the revolutionized means of production allow that. So within it, I mean, this is all, of course, the sort of dialectics, isn't it? Within the beginnings of surplus and within the beginnings of this horrific period for women and for us and capitalism is the seeds of actually coming alive again on a much higher level than hunter and gatherers were, you know, in a much easier way of living. But of course, you know, there is no big game anymore. So we have to, in a much easier way that deals with the situation as it is today. So within this capitalist horrific production and, you know, the beginning of surplus, etc., is the liberation of humanity, womankind, on a much higher level than it had ever been before. And that is so inspiring about this whole subject.
Thank you, Tina. Over to Brian.
Yeah, I just want to make a quick point to Nick. Nick, you're absolutely right. The really delightful paradox of history is that the most inferior food, i.e. the grasses which we began to grow, the most inferior food is actually the basis of civilization, because it created a permanent agricultural surplus without which civilization couldn't have taken off. And one of the reasons why people shrunk to about 4'3" to 4'6" is because in nature, everything tries to defend itself. So these grasses have anti-nutrients in them, which are called phytates and oxalates, and their purpose is to bind to calcium. And if your calcium becomes unavailable, then you develop small, a small skeleton, you shrink, you eat less of the grades. And it was only when people learned how to get rid of these anti-nutrients, and this is particularly true in Central America, that they began to grow a bit bigger. The point I want to make, the main point though, is that when the Victorian professors, especially at the University of London, heard that Engels was promoting primitive communism, they kind of took all the material and buried it in the deepest basement in the University of London. And it really only surfaced in the 1960s. And the significance of this was that it was part of the women's movement that actually brought this to the fore and caused this material to resurface and to become popular. And, anthropologists like Margaret Mead play a crucial role in all of this. The final point I want to talk about is slightly more tangential. We were talking about the difficulty of raising the young in primitive communist societies. It's up to the age of 5, really, before a child can run at any pace. And so the whole clan had to defend the young against marauding animals and so on and so forth. Now, anthropological biologists, evolutionary biologists, point to the fact that only humans and whales have a menopause. No other species have a menopause. The female part of the species is fertile until the day they die. Now, the reason they said this would happen was when grandmothers lost the ability to have babies, to become pregnant, it obviously improved the ratio of adults to children within the clan. And I find that a really, really interesting observation. I'm not sure if anybody else has heard about it, but it shows you how evolution really does work. That's me.
You're down as Gary, but I didn't. Can you unmute yourself?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I'm down as Gary. It's actually Anita Patel. We're sharing the device. Yeah, no, actually, so, okay, this is really interesting and not much I've read about here. So I'm going to raise some issues, mostly out of instinct more than anything else. And hopefully the panel will come back later on to correct me if I'm wrong. But I do, I think it's quite fascinating that Engels and Rosa Luxemburg were able to come to that conclusion so clearly about primitive societies being matrilineal societies, given the kind of evidence that was available then. I think, yeah, I agree, actually. I think the human society's imperative is to be a matrilineal society. And I think that's a lot to do with childcare. The best way to do childcare is collective childcare, and matrilineal societies happen to be the best way to actually do that. And I think that raises the point that Brian was making about, grandmothers being an important element of that, despite the fact that they're not reproductive sort of in their reproductive capacity. The thing, one of the things that I think that actually that imperative is there, because if your preoccupation is just to kind of produce children and create an environment for them, which is the best environment possible, then it has to be collective. In a class society, the imperative is to reproduce the class. And therefore, we're producing a different kind of sets of children within that. And I think reproduction of children in a class society is actually a really big prize for children to play and for the class to play as well. And I think that sort of has continued for a long time. The well-being of children does not actually work very well in this kind of class society where we sort of separate them out and create bourgeois societies, nuclear families, in order to sort of recreate those kind of class structures and recreate and reproduce those class structures. And I think there is a huge price to pay for that. But, and that price does create contradictions. And I think they're imperative for sort of communism and collective living is here with us now, and it will always be with us. It's not something that happened in the past, and we need to kind of look at the past sort of societies in order to say, oh, which way are we going? Which is not to say we shouldn't look. So I have a problem with the term remnants of communism. And I don't know if that's the right way to kind of, look at this. We don't have to make any excuses for communism. I think communism is within us right now, and the contradictions that we have to come over lead us to communism. I also have a problem with anthropological studies. I mean, I don't know what anthropology is here. Is it study of non-capitalist mode of production societies? And if it is it possible to do that actually in the current sort of capitalist mode of production dominated society or the world? So I have a problem with whether there is anything, valuable to be get out of this kind of studies, which is not to say, actually, one of the most interesting things happened was when I went to Freud's house in North London, when he arrived here as a refugee. His study is incredibly interesting. It is just full of artifacts of, ancient societies and all that. So in a sense, just as we are really fascinated by, primitive societies, ancient societies, how did they live, and the artifacts that come out of it that tell us about that, I found that quite interesting. But I don't know how much of that actually contributes to us as socialists in the direction we're going in with that. Finally, sorry, one more point about Tina's thing about this kind of scarcity that led to, the setting up of sort of societies, which then kind of became hierarchical. I also think, I feel it's more likely to be, we also have a predisposition to create that surplus, we want to make those advances. We want to capture society and nature in a way that creates technology, that creates spare time, that creates all kinds of abilities that we do. I don't think it is just a question of scarcity that forced us to do that. Yes, we had a price to pay for the arriving where we are and control over nature and control over technology and all that kind of thing, which is, we have a patriarchal society, alienated society, difficult sort of lives that people lead. But again, the imperative to sort of then lead us to socialism is always going to be there. I'm not sure I would have wanted to choose to remain in a paradise of berries and salmon fishing society. I would rather be in a society where we have mastered technology and we can have communism, we can have both. Thank you.
Shall we have to take another questioner first, or do you want to come back on anything urgently? Marion, would you unmute yourself? Marion? Hello? Can you hear me? Marion?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting discussion. I think it's quite important, this discussion, because when you look back into prehistory, if you want to call it that when human beings lived more collectively. And for me, collectivism is the most important thing. If we collect, that big item on the news today that a lot of women are having to give up employment because childcare is just so expensive. But if you had collective childcare, if we had collective kitchens and all those kind of things, we could reorganise society that would free both men and women to live fulfilled lives. If there is enough wealth in the world for us to be able to reorganise society, for every society to live in that way, and where there could be more democracy, where there could be more localism, where people could organise, and it would be a better world. And that's the important thing for me, because the other thing is when the matriarchy was overthrown, that's when the position of women became a lot worse. And Tina and others have outlined how that happened. But I think it is important that we recognise the role of anthropologists like Morgan and Marx and Engels and Rosa Luxemburg for bringing this information. And like another book that's really quite important in terms of rewriting women back into history was Sheila Rowbotham's book on Hidden from History. And it's been a pet theme of mine about us recording our history more. I always argued that at Women's TUC that a lot of this stuff should be recorded, because a lot of it gets lost. You know, if you don't record it at the time, once the memories of the people involved, it's lost. And that's another tradition. So for me, I think it's quite important that, and also it debunks the idea of, oh, it's human nature. Greed is human nature. You know, the number of times I've been told that you can't change the society to be what you want because it goes against human nature. Well, this gives us the arguments that it hasn't always been the human condition to be greedy, not to share, not to work collectively. So I think it gives us a good argument to have with the people that say, oh, it's human nature, you can't change anything. Because that's what the capitalists want us to believe, because that way they can keep exploiting us and imprisoning us. So I think it's really important discussion that we're having tonight. That's it for me now.
Thank you. Unless there's anything urgent.
Maybe briefly not on Marion, I think I agree with all of that. You know, the need for collective childcare again is absolutely important, especially if you have children. You know how much effort it takes to keep a little person alive, etc. And it's crazy next door somebody's doing exactly the same thing. If you just combined efforts locally, I mean, you would free up women so much. No question. Just on Anita asked a few questions, and you know, what is anthropology, and what does it teach us? Does it just look at non-capitalist societies, etc.? I mean, anthropology is, as I understand it, I'm not an expert on it either. It's just, you know, looking at how humanity developed, and as it happened, it was non-capitalist. You know, I mean, it's a huge advancement to understand that, and we can't overestimate this enough. It all happened in this period of where Marx and Engels were writing, and it's reflected in their changing views on the matter. You know, in 50, 60 years, things dramatically changed our understanding of societies, that it wasn't always class struggle, but there was a socialism of sorts. There was collectivity, there was holding things in common, etc., and all of that happened in that period. So that understanding is huge, and that makes, I think, anthropology one of the most important sciences there are. And Marx and Engels certainly understood it, and of course they looked also at biology and all these, and evolution, what Darwin's developments, etc. And in terms of your idea that you don't think it was scarcity or a need to change things and to get into farming and to breed, etc., but that we have a curiosity to do it, or perhaps to make life easier, that might be so, but it is quite a coincidence that archaeology proves this, you know, that at that time when farming started to develop, big game died out. Either they were killed off by hunter-gatherers. Climate change as well played a role. So there seemed to be a need to develop something else and to go a different direction in order to survive. I mean, when you look at how hunter-gatherers lived, it was very close to how paradise is described in the Bible. You know, it's you live with the land, you have parties, you know, different kind of parties that we would have today, but you know, you enjoy life, you're collective, you know, you you hunt in the morning, you fish in the evening, you sing, you dance, you live, you just live to live. You don't live to work, etc. So, I think it had to be a need, certainly seems to be more likely from my perspective as instead of, all the human nature wants us to create a surplus and to start farming, etc. I think it was more a need. And of course it got colder and you had to start, sort of surviving in the winter. And I think that certainly played a role with it as well.
Thank you. Oh, Rob.
Just like to come in on that. I do think that the kind of notion that it was due to the dying out of big game as the kind of foundation of farming society. And I mean, perhaps we're not here to talk about the kind of specifics of the development of humanity, but the earliest civilizations, the earliest agricultural-based civilizations were in the Near East, and what is known as the cradle of civilization, the Tigris Basin. This was a society, like I said before, that was in a temporal kind of area, and that led to a scarcity of resources that pushed it up, right? Many of the Northern European societies that were reliant on hunting for big game, etc., continued in that practice, and it was the civilization once formed began to spread across the whole of the Mediterranean, and it spread into North Africa, and it spread into southern Europe. Okay, and we've got this Northern European world that is pre-Roman conquest, that was an entirely tribal-based system. And Marx and Engels referred to the Celts in this kind of notion that there was not the same relationship with agriculture and civilization. Much smaller familial groups dotted all over the place. It didn't spring up all at once from everywhere. It spread, and the idea of civilization spread. And this is true that it comes with hierarchy, but I think it's important to note that there is a human relativism, that world over there is no two human societies that you can say are exactly the same. There's no identity that you can particularly hang on human nature. I think Marx gets at this, that there is no fixed human nature. So what John was talking about last week, the kind of concept of alienation, that human nature is subject to its conditions, subject to its environment. It's adaptable. It responds to the situation that it's faced with. And I think that we see throughout human history a plethora of different social models. And this is not to disagree with feminism. This is not to disagree with the role of women in society. I am 100% a feminist. I'm on board with women in society, and I think that we should have equal status and equal rights and everything. The idea that there was an entirely unified society that was matrilineal is too fixed for my position. Really, it's too concrete. It's too and I would say that there would be parts of society, parts of the world that definitely were. I've already referred to the temple builders on Malta. They had huge statues dedicated to female fertility goddesses. You see fertility goddesses across the Neolithic in different places. But then you also see phallic gods that have big, massive penises, right? And then also, to contrast that, you've got the Roman and Greek kind of outlook, right? And Marx and Engels refer to the Romans and Greeks quite a lot as the important kind of developers of modern civilization. And that was an incredibly patriarchal society, incredibly, very sexist. In Athens, women had to wear a full veil. They were fully veiled in Athens, in ancient Athens, and this is the time of the great Athenian democracy. That was the state of women in Athens at that time. I think it's more likely that model of patriarchy is the one that was replicated within capitalism, and that there are different models of human relations all over the world that have a pluralistic outlook. There you are.
Thanks very much. Without further ado, because there's a few things there I'd quite like to come back on as well. John.
Oh yeah, sorry. So I'll be as brief as I can here. But basically, I agree with what Rob said, and it's very interesting. And I like the contributions. And it's a very interesting topic. But there is some danger in it that we oversimplify. we oversimplify things, which to an extent I think Engels did. I don't think Rosa Luxemburg did in the same manner, but you can reduce history to a, as Engels quite often did, a series of stages which are necessary. You've got an end in mind. We go from primitive communism through slavery, through feudalism, through capitalism, and end up with communism. And I think that doesn't take into account the complex nature of the processes. And I think there is also a danger, when Tina was talking about that, I mean, I've talked about it myself, you can overemphasize how terrific things were in the past, that it's basically a life of parties and stuff, whereas societies are so varied in their complexity, and some, the Kung Bushman bands, hunter-gatherers, but everything is so scarce that they have to spend most of their time in creating, collecting food to live by, all those things. There is no time for inequalities of wealth because there is such a scarcity within that population. So I think it's a danger of simplifying things, and that seems to me to be the problem with anthropology. And it has to be said that it is the case with Morgan. It's somebody looking at a society from outside that society. And Morgan had connections with the military institutions within the areas that he was discussing. So that has to be taken into account. It's people looking from the outside at societies that are very complex, and it's getting to grips with that. There are all sorts of difficulties in looking at those societies in terms of language, culture, etc. And there can be a reductionist, approach to that from social anthropology. You also have to bear in mind a lot of these studies are based on a colonial experience. Evans Pritchard examining the Nur culture in South Africa, and you can't understand a complex society, cattle herders in the main. And one of the things they do, which he has difficulty understanding, is when they pass each other in the countryside, they spit at each other. Now, what an awful experience that is. So he has difficulty in interpreting that, but that is their sign of greeting. That's what they do. What he also can't understand, he's talking about the Nur, is he's wandering around the countryside and he gets lost. It's a foreign territory. He doesn't know where he's going, and he asks somebody, and they tell him the way somewhere or other, and he wanders off down in that direction, and he's completely lost again. He cannot understand why these people are sending him all over the place in this country. Then, of course, you have to realize that the RAF are bombing that territory, that it's a colonial experience. It's a domination of the British in South Africa. And he expects the Nur people to be friendly and cooperative with him. It's not the experience. And the other thing is, it is very complex, but, Rob has talked about the Maasai people in Kenya. Again, it's a very complex territory, and there's a danger in oversimplifying even that experience. And there was a film on the BBC not long ago called The First Grader, which is about Kenya, and it basically experienced the experience of an 80-year-old man going back to school in Kenya, first opportunity, but he comes from the Kikuyu tribe in Kenya. And there's a division between the Kikuyu, or sections of the Kikuyu, and the Maasai. And the British are exploiting those divisions. They've obviously had an experience of anthropology examining those societies and advising them. And they are creating divisions between the Kikuyu people and the Maasai people. So in all those experiences, we've got to be very careful about what we are learning about these societies. And we've got to take into account that basically colonialism and imperialism, that is rooted in the anthropology that we are subject to. Now, I'm not trying to take all this to pieces, because I think it is very interesting and the complexity of it. But I think what it shows is what Tina emphasized, I think, is that basically there are human behavior is so varied that there is a potential for a different form of society, that we don't have to live in the society in which we've inhabited for the past 200 years, or a similar sort of society. There are potential within the examinations of other cultures that can enable us to see that human beings can live differently.
Thank you, John. Anthony.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I'm going to answer John, and then I'm going to talk about why communism is relevant for today. But I thought John was the most revisionist in this debate, because what Marxism does, it looks at the mode of production as the predominant form. But I try to talk about the uneven and combined development, because the Maoist debate, primitive communism, was very good for the comrades that said in this discussion, because of the collectivism, but because it was on a very low material basis, cannibalism and all the other problems of survival, it could not develop. I think Rob's quite correct. The big game, Tina might be correct. The big game did disappear, but the key thing was as Tina said later, was the Neolithic revolution. As Rob said, that was the key thing that led to surplus. You couldn't have classes, and you can't have classes about modes of production and relations of production and private ownership. But Rob's been up to that. Marxism is never deterministic. It sees different features at different times. Morgan took 40 years. I was reading Engels' fourth preface. It took 40 years to research this, and it was at the time of evolution with Darwin. And Trotsky said in defense of Marxism, like Hegel, it came before Marx. And Darwin was in between Marx and Hegel. They were geniuses because they used the dialectical materialist method, despite Darwin's empiricism. And Hegel's idealism, negation and negation, interpenetration of opposites, which Marx then used to reevaluate with a more dialectical view, saw this. And there's no determinism in Marxism. But once the Maoist said, the class, I was reading something about the proof of the Maoist, class society was a major step, it was a step forward, but a major setback in social organization. Because I've had to think on my feet to prepare speech. So I'll think back now. I'll get back there in a second.
Yeah, it's all right.
I'll come to the point now. Then I'll finish with the last couple of points. But after that, it taught society forward in terms of surpluses. But what class society was? But once class society emerged, this is the central point where John goes wrong. And this goes back to Marxism. The seeds of a new mode of production are in the old. For example, the feudal and the decay of land when the Roman Empire fell, when the whole of Europe's roads disappeared, as Max Weber said, in bourgeois sociology, or capitalism in the world markets, or the worker state emerges at the socialist revolution with the working class or middle class forces with Stalin. It's a overthrow capitalism and you have a bureaucratic caste. But I think the environment, as I think Tina said in a little bit through my comments, might have some influence. The environment was a major step forward. Without the Ice Age, as Aaron Teachman said, you wouldn't have had class society, so I learned that. But capitalism is threatening nuclear suicide in the early talks, and the environmental damage. We need a world, as Trotsky said in 1940, we need world socialism and communism even more. A lot of the left have lost confidence in the ideas. A lot of the Trotskyists broke from Trotskyism. We'll go back to some of those ideas. As we said in Note Me, never Vanguard Pride, but I'll talk about the worker states more next week. Don't go on the same. I got reconnected. I had to think on my feet. Something I had prepared at the end I was going to say.
All right.
The other point was, on Russia, Engels thought that you didn't need to go for a capitalist state, you could go to a worker state. It wouldn't be the peasantry though, because they're middle class. But capitalism, it was too premature because you didn't have a capitalist class for a reformation. But when it was right for the proletarian revolution, you couldn't go for bourgeois liberalism. That's where the first worker state, and that's type of Trotsky's theory upon revolution. I'll leave it there.
Thank you, mate. That's great. Thanks very much. I'd just like to chip in my couple of little questions, if you wouldn't mind. I've got a couple of things. First of all, the transition from barbarism to civilization is being discussed quite understandably in terms of a loss of women's position in society, and that's entirely understandable that one can see that there's something lost as well in the transition from feudalism to capitalism. If you're a feudal peasant, at least you've got access to the land. However, this question of about abundance is, of course, crucial. Because, of course, bored middle-class women also wrote some bloody good books. And so, for that matter, did, bored Russian aristocrats. The question of abundance and a place in society. But there's another feature as well of the move to civilization. So whilst Jane Austen was knocking out cracking novels, women like my great aunt Sarah were working in coal mines. And but at the same time, of course, that involvement in the workplace for working class women also makes them workers, and is part of the universalization, in a sense, of workers as workers, without necessarily that gender division. So, for example, I have to take up Rob on one thing. I am most definitely not a feminist because I see feminism as, in a sense, analogous to nationalism. I'm saying, well, women should unite as women, whereas I would argue that workers should unite as workers, and that the gender division is something that we need to struggle against as communists, in our implacable opposition to discrimination against women and any other groups of people on the basis of gender or sexuality or whatever else. But at the same time, we're not arguing that women should organise as women. I am comfortable with the idea of women, like International Women's Day. Let's just remember that was a communist holiday. It wasn't just about a feminist thing, which is coming to being. I'll leave mine there because obviously there may be other people who want to come back in. So, do you want to respond to that, and any of the other contributors? Tina.
Yeah, I was also going to say I'm not a feminist for sure. It depends a bit on how you define it, of course. Mariam put it in the chat, a socialist feminist of sorts. Yeah, Clara Zetkin, Rosa Luxemburg clearly identified not as that feminists. They identified against bourgeois feminism, which was very much led by women who demanded, rich women should have the right to vote. Rich women should have the same position as rich men. They didn't look after, or they didn't care, couldn't care less about working class women, didn't fight for their right to vote, etc. So, today that's slightly different, though. I would also say that, I identify as working class, socialist, communist, not feminist. I don't think women have to organize separately or opposed to men, which often is the case. Equal rights, of course, goes without saying, but that is, I think, sums it up with being a communist. That we don't think women should be organized separately, and if they want to, of course, if women want to organize separately, they can. I've never seen the particular point of it. In terms of human nature, somebody asked in the chat, is human nature then bad, or is it good, or and I think John made a good point, and Rob as well. I think it depends on your circumstances often, isn't it? There's no real such thing as human nature. We are animals, humans are very much animals. We are collective animals. We live, social animals. Everything we do we do with other people, we work with other people, we live with other people, so we're social animals, and we can behave like assholes sometimes. Everybody can, but I think in general, and this is this was a point about some of these primitive egalitarian societies, when it has to be, which was found that when women in matrilineal societies, women don't use strength to put down men or whatever. They use laughter. If somebody, if the alpha male was trying to, get more meat or whatever than the others, they ridiculed him, and that's how they used human nature to, in a funny way, etc. So human nature is what depends on how we live in this capitalist society. Human nature is certainly doesn't bring out the best in people usually, and in different societies it can be quite different. On the key point, though, is I think when John was speaking and, you know, saying oversimplifying it, and did that really all exist like this, matrilineal societies, etc., and Morgan oversimplified it, etc. I'm not sure that modern anthropologists would agree with that. Again, I'm not an anthropologist. I have, you know, but I have been listening to quite a few of the openings by the radical anthropology group, and they're really up to date, etc. And it seems that what Rosa Luxemburg described as well seems to have been, in general, the rule. So for millions of years, perhaps, or for not millions, hundreds of thousands of years at least, you know, modern Homo sapiens, since the brain got bigger, and etc., that the matrilineal clan was the main way of living. There were some minor exceptions, etc. And matrilineal doesn't mean the woman is, you know, in charge, bossing everybody around. This just reflects how households are organized, that it's tends to be the household run by the women. It doesn't make men second, you know, or unimportant, or they were second class or something like that. It was very egalitarian. But the way people lived used to be around childcare and collectivity. And that very much goes with what Brian was saying, the grandmother theory. I had enough time to develop that, but there's a huge part of it, and the menopause and all of that. The grandmother helps her daughter raise the children, and all the grandmothers do it. They help raise all the children. They can't have children anymore themselves. So yes, they do increase the ratio of women to children, of people who help raising children. And there is plenty of evidence, masses of evidence. And it seems, I don't think it's disputed that this was the general rule. The way Rosa Luxemburg describes it, and she does take the evidence from the colonialists. This is a huge part of her book. I mean, comrades should really read it. It's the tax authorities, the English tax authorities, that send letters home saying, we don't know what's going on here in India. You know, we're trying to get tax and we don't know who to approach because there's nobody in charge. All these villages are, you know, they hold the land in common. They're all, they have a sort of elected leader, but he can't make decisions. You know, there's no money to extract. There is no, you know, it's all organized collectively. We don't know how to get money out of them. And they find the same thing in Africa, and etc. And these are the documents by the ruling class, written by the people who despise these communistic societies. They write these documents home because they don't understand what the hell is going on. And it's people like, you know, Morgan, Engels, and Rosa Luxemburg who explain it, who understand what the hell is actually going on. I.e., this is the generality, is the matrilineal clan, with some varieties, and there are, you know, various tribes. Some are yes, have differences in the group marriages and how that works, and etc. But the idea of, you know, the man-led or patriarchal tribes, etc., that develops later, as I understand it, with the Neolithic, etc. But logically, it makes much more sense to have the childcare collectivized, because it makes it easier for everybody. You know, it doesn't mean it means you have to spend less time. You know, it makes it more rational to do everything collective, rather than, you know, this household is cooking there and this one is there and you have to look after one child. Of course, it should be collectivized. It makes absolute sense. So while there are differences, etc., I don't think there's any dispute in, you know, any sort of highly regarded anthropologists about that this was the general picture. I mean, all these things with the phallus sculptures, etc. Again, I understand this is part of the Neolithic. Stonehenge is also a really interesting discussion about Stonehenge possibly being a sculpture to the Neolithic and trying to turn over female rule into male rule, you know, matrilineal clan into paternalistic society, etc. But I understand that these were all kind of from, you know, maybe 6,000 years ago, not from 30, 40, 50, 100,000 years ago, when pretty much everything was organized on the matrilineal clan. It's also this idea that hunter-gatherers, you know, in general, as John said, spent the majority of their time collecting berries and had no free time, and were just busy, collecting, eating, etc. It's not true. Again, from what anthropologists tell us, when as long as the weather was okay and there was good big game there, it was not very much work at all, because they lived hand to mouth, and you kill a mammoth, the tribe lives off it, or the Gens lives off it for weeks. You supplement it with a few nuts, etc. Doesn't take all day to collect all of that. They had quite an easy lifestyle, and they didn't keep it. They didn't plan for winter or whatever, because there was still stuff around in winter. You didn't have to hoard things, etc. From what I understand, again, I'm not an expert on this, but from reading that, it was the opposite of a hard life, and it was quite a good life.
Thank you. Are there any more questions, or do you want to come back on anything, Rob? I have another little thing I would like to ask about. But
yeah, would you like to go first, Ian?
Yes, it's about ideal types, I suppose. Coming from a sociology background, I mean, there's a bit of me that understands why people bristle a little bit. And anthropologists, I mean, anthropologists during the colonial period are going around and effectively collecting human specimens and classifying them in much the same way as a biologist will look at and divide things up into kingdom, phylum, class, order, species, and so on. There is an element of that in anthropology. But the other thing is that we don't need to be afraid either of qualitative research. Just as Marx spent an awful lot of his time going through Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Factories and gathering huge amounts of quantitative data, Engels was wandering about the streets of Manchester as an anthropologist. And that qualitative insight was an enormously powerful, produced an enormously powerful book. It's given how early a work it is, and given that what a young man he was, it's an extraordinarily powerful thing to read, I find. Ideal types. So one of the features that you get, for example, in Weberian sociology is that Weber talks in ideal types. So when he's talking about the Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism, he's talking about an ideal type of Protestant society. This is a heuristic device. This is not a society that ever actually properly existed. And the problem sometimes with anthropology is, of course, if you're talking in terms of stages of development and a notion of the transition from one period to another, the concrete differences can sometimes be blurred, as it were, and it starts to read like a kind of Weberian ideal type. What I find interesting about Engels' Origin of the Family is that he's drawing upon this very kind of direct empirical experience, and he's drawing conclusions, but it's not the same as just saying an ideal type. He's not suggesting that this is, he's talking about the Iroquois gens and how that tells us something about ourselves. And this is why I feel very strongly about that. There is a genuine trans-historical human nature. We are collective. We do work on nature and change it, and in so doing, we change ourselves. And we could not be anything other than collective. And arguably, one of the features about alienation, as people will know, I feel very strongly that there are real psychiatric disorders out there, and they're real things, and they're physical, because there's no such thing as a division between mind and body. But that, for example, human alienation does make up a proportion of what constitutes human distress. The anxiety of going to work because your boss is an asshole is a very real, visceral feeling. Ideal types. What I would argue is that Engels wasn't engaging in an ideal type. He was using empirical data to come up with a series of historical generalizations. He wasn't making something up in the way that Weber did, for example, or in the way that some other anthropologists did. And that was all I have to say. Are there any other questions from the floor? And if not, do you want to move to your summation, Rob?
Okay. Yeah, I think it's been an interesting discussion. I think, kind of looking at I'm interested in the ideas that Tina's put forward, really about kind of matrilineal society. I think I'd like to read more about that and learn a bit more about it. I've done extensive reading into Neolithic culture, and what I've seen is that it's hard to kind of ascribe values to the entirety of Neolithic culture. There are different relationships, different kinds of, you cannot underestimate the ingenuity of the Stone Age people. There's a huge amount there that you can look at, and what were this? When we're not sure, we don't know what the structures of those societies were. We cannot guarantee that this was an overturning of one society and movement of another. There's no written record. There's no concrete evidence that says that's the case. I'm interested to learn more about the theory for sure. And so if you'd like to send me a link after the meeting, Tina, I'd like to check that out. And to sum up, we didn't talk about primitive accumulation very much, which I think we kind of talked around it. Colonialism was mentioned numerous times, which really is the biggest example of primitive accumulation. And Tina at the end there kind of referenced that the British are putting these values onto these societies that they're encountering in colonial, these people have no encounters of money. And there's a novel story of a British tax collector in Uganda trying to collect the taxes from the native population, and they paid him in cowrie shells, and he was completely baffled. He was like, "Why have they paid me in cowrie shells?" And then they made it illegal to exchange in cowrie shells, and you've got to use the currency that we provide. They didn't provide enough currency, and it was a whole farce. The whole management of colonialism is a farce in so many ways. A complete misunderstanding of the people they were encountering, and a complete butchery of that social relations. This is where primitive accumulation becomes important, because the reason that these societies progressed was not due to an inbuilt capitalistic tendency. It was due to the oppression of an external invader, and the separation of their common land, their common means of production from the people, and then the resultant wage labor that they used from the colonial from all peoples to expand their own capital endeavors. Marx talks about this a lot. It's really worth reading. So I think there are lessons to be learned from primitive communism. There are notions of societies and ideas that we can take from these groups that we can think that's interesting. And how can, what does that tell us about humanity? Much in the way that Ian just spoke about what Engels was saying. I think, it's less. I am fixed in the position that there is not a concrete definition. I wouldn't say that there is a fixed human nature. I obviously believe that there is a degree of human nature, and I think that it's, like we've said, kind of collective. But I would say that the shape and format of that is variable, dependent on environment. So excellent conversation, guys. I'm hyped up. So I'll pass over to Tina for summation over there.
It's been brilliant. I noticed Felicity put her hand up very briefly. Do you want to ask your question before Tina sums up? Is she there?
Felicity, you can talk if you want to.
About kibbutzim or something?
Yeah. Hi. Sorry, I'm just not in the right frame to be on screen. Yeah, mine was about the kibbutzim as an example of a collective, because they collectively looked after, children were collectively looked after. They shared their food equally. They lived in a communal environment. So how do the panel see that as an example?
It's just a shame they exploit the Palestinians, isn't it?
Well, of course. Well, look, we're not talking about that.
Exactly. Tony Greenstein makes quite a good point about it. It looks socialistic, etc. If you're Israeli, but it's no longer a part, isn't it? But it's not really a part of Israeli society at the moment, is it? I mean, they've moved far away from the kibbutzim. It's initially by the Jews that went from Europe to Israel to the found, and I'm not talking about legitimacy, because I have many problems and I'm pro-Palestinian. I mean, I think what happened to the Palestinians, so it's nothing to do with that. But I'm just saying that when they moved
when they started their nascent society, the kibbutz was a very important part of that. And to what extent can what we've been talking about be seen as an example?
I think there's a difficulty as well of having socialism in one village or one kibbutz,
Yeah.
or it's quite possible and has been done numerous occasions. I mean, if you there were Robert Owen, for example, attempted a socialistic organization in New Lanark, and of course, subsequently in moving to America, there were communal types of societies. I mean, the Amish, for example, were in a sense a kind of Christian socialistic organization.
As were the Black Panthers, and groups like
that.
And
but that's in a sense, yes, we could do it now. Half a dozen of us could set up a commune somewhere, and I dare say it would be all right. But it wouldn't assist one flea hop towards socialism, really, which I think requires collectivity and abundance, and above all, the overthrow of the bourgeoisie as a precondition, and that's the difficulty, I think. But thank you. That's some more food for thought, and the more discussion, the better. So, but we're speeding towards 9 o'clock, and therefore I would like to hear Tina Werkmann.
Well, John Fitzgerald also, I think, wants to ask a question or say something briefly.
Yeah, sorry, I haven't got my camera on and having problems with it. Yeah, very interesting discussion. It's just crossed my mind. Is there any evidence of sort of approximately what age these people lived to, these primitive societies? Is there any kind of, yeah, that's it really.
Okay, I can sum up. I don't know properly by that, but as you do know, Rob knows. Go on.
Yes, John. There's human fossils, and human fossils tell you a huge amount about the way people lived. The bone structure of people hasn't really changed that much. Since the kind of advent of Homo sapiens sapien, and from the fossils you can tell the kind of lifestyle that somebody lived. So you can tell, one, how old they are by the state of the bones. You can tell if they died in youth or if they died in full maturity. You can tell if they died in old age or if they died in young age by, like I was referring to before, the structure of spinal columns, the erosion of teeth. The forensic evidence you can look at human fossil evidence. Now, there's not a lot of human fossil evidence from, really early hunter-gatherer society. So we are, kind of maximalizing what we have. But if we dig, we will find more. So yeah. That's what I've got to say on that.
You don't really know either. Well, I think it is difficult to say, isn't it? I mean, but when anthropologists look at like some of these tribes, etc., they seem old enough to be grandmothers that help out with the raising of the children, though you can't be a grandmother with 40 or 50, of course. I doubt they live to over 100, but I don't know about that either. It's difficult to say. I mean, for me, especially Rosa Luxemburg was eye-opening when reading her introduction to political economy, and I would urge again comrades to do that. She, like Marx and Engels, was a scientific socialist. She didn't just, think that we should have something more communistic because it's better, but she explained why we must have a better society because this will lead to war, etc., capitalism, and B, because we have lived through our vast majority of history in a very different way, in a collective way, in a non-alienated way, in a non-war way, in a way where we shared things, and we shared land, and we shared everything in common. Doesn't mean there are no fights, you know, that doesn't mean there's no trouble or confrontation, etc. But it was on an entirely different level. It's fascinating how she describes, for example, how decisions are made by, you know, you have the Gens, the leader of the Gens are elected by their family clan. They get together ever so often whenever a decision needs to be made. Everybody can participate, everybody's around it, can ask questions, can ridicule the leader of a Gent. The leader of a Gent can be replaced there and then by the rest of the Gent if she doesn't do what they want, etc. It's deeply democratic. And this is, again, something that might not have been exactly like that in every single Gent and every single clan. But I think there is, not just from Rosa, but also from Rosa Luxemburg, but also from modern anthropologists who look, you know, who find these archaeological evidences, enough evidence that something very similar was happening everywhere across the planet. Sometimes perhaps inspired by each other when people were moving around, but also because it made sense. It helped this collectivity around childcare, etc. was needed for the brain to grow. So it wasn't just cooking meat, etc. The women needed to be able, you know, if you compare women and animals, you know, when an animal is born, it's ready, you know, it runs along, it's finished. You don't have to look after it anymore. You know, the mother of the animal, whatever it's called. Humans, you need 2-3 years real hard work looking after your child, because it's not quite finished. The brain is so big, etc. You need so many people looking after a child that is very intensive. So there is the theory by the radical anthropology group that women banded together to collectivize childcare and to keep men in check, and it made a lot of sense to me. I do urge comrades to look at the radical anthropology group. There's a book called Blood Relations by Chris Knight, who's describing this human revolution, the female revolution, with evidence that they've collected and others have collected, how it led to development of culture, etc. Camilla Power is also very good, and there are anthropologists who are not socialists who support most of these ideas. And as I understand it is mainstream now that childcare was collectivized, that people lived collectivized around the women's household. You know, it wasn't feminism, it was just organized around the woman's household and etc. The collectivity around children and women. And so that is deeply inspiring. And like Morgan, I think the idea of abundance, the idea that now we are in a position to learn these collectivity from the past, to move forward on a higher level. I think that is quite key, that we don't argue, oh, there's too many people on the planet and we need to reduce numbers before we can have, again, some kind of human way of living with the planet. No, we can do it. We can do it on a higher level than the hunter-gatherers did, by, you know, making use of the revolutionized means of production and producing things and living in harmony with nature. That is still possible if we get our act together in time. Well, on that happy note, I'll finish.
Thank you very much, comrades. I think nobody would disagree. Did you want to come back, Rob? I think it's been an excellent discussion. I've thoroughly enjoyed every minute of it. Next week on Why Marx, we'll be looking at societies that have called themselves socialist. How are we to understand it? Because if we think about human nature as something which is used to argue against communism, another argument is look at it in practice. And what we'll discuss was what was the nature of the Soviet Union, what was the nature of China, and what are they today? So thank you very much, comrades, and good night.
Good night, comrades.